Hi everyone, my name is Johannes Köhn and I'm the CEO of Looklet.
My name is Noelani Malley and I am VP of Brand and Client Relations.
And we welcome you to the Future of Fashion e-commerce forum. No one could have predicted the disruptions to the fashion community over the last year. Even as retail leaders worked quickly to digitize their operations, manage remote teams and stabilize their global supply chains, the pandemic caused a seismic shift in our industry, which is set to evolve even faster in 2022 and beyond. At Looklet, we help fashion retailers and brands create high-quality, on-model fashion imagery cost-effectively and at scale. And we are proud to have supported retailers adapt their operations during these challenging times.
Over the last year, we've helped our clients across North America and Europe scale and simplify their studio operations, manage their apparel photography from anywhere, and create on-model images safely and remotely without the need for models, hair and makeup artists, photographers, or Digitex on set.
We believe that these digital capabilities will give an even more competitive edge in a more accelerated post-pandemic world.
Today, we've invited 3 innovators from the retail community to talk about their experiences from 2020 and how retailers and brands can rethink the future of retail and e-commerce, become more agile, and chart a course for the future. The agenda will run in 2 parts. The first will be around learnings from 2020, and in the second, we'll look at strategies that retailers and brands need to employ to stay ahead. Please join me in welcoming Taleeb Noormohamed, CEO at Jane, Michelle Bacharach, founder and CEO at Find Mine, and Nicole Brown, former head of Global Production Studios for Amazon.
All right, let's get started with a roundtable of introductions of our speakers today.
Everyone, I'm Nicole Brown. I'm a creative operations specialist, primarily focused in the photography industry. I most recently spent the last 8 years with Amazon within their product imaging group as their global photo producer. And the last 1.5 years I spent at Prime Video Marketing, leading their global production studio, which was actually a team of designers. And I'm thrilled to be here today.
Everyone, my name is Taleeb Noormohamed. I'm the CEO at Jane.com, which is a marketplace for apparel and home goods. And I've been at Jane for the last couple of years. And before that was the co-founder of another marketplace in home goods. And before that was the chief growth officer at Farfetch. So very happy to be with all of you today and looking forward to this conversation.
Michelle Bacharach. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Find Mine. And Find Mine is a retail technology platform using AI to help scale the creative process of communicating the brand's unique editorial point of view.
So looking back at the year that was, what were the most important learnings you took from 2020? Michelle, we might start with you.
Yeah, 2020 was a trip. I think that from our perspective as a technology company serving the retail industry, it was really peculiar in that our customers who are brands and retailers, and they use our software to automate the creation of things like outfits and lookbooks or style guides, interior design guidance. And most of them are omni-channel brands or retailers, but their stores were all closed for a large part of the pandemic. And even when the stores opened, foot traffic was down so much that their overall just revenue position was completely, decimated. But their traffic on e-com was out the roof. It was just crazy. And so our software provides this content on, e-com, email, social media, advertising, and stores as well. Obviously, e-com was the channel that completely took off. And so our server costs actually went through the roof. And we had to do a lot of, we experienced just this massive growth in usage, but not necessarily in revenue. So we had to get really smart about efficiency within our operations. And so that's something that we really went through the wall on in 2020. And then on the brands and retailer side, I saw them all having the same challenge. It was, e-commerce is exploding. Oh, congratulations on your e-commerce growth. And they're like, yeah, don't congratulate us. It's terrible. We have no resources. We have no money. Everything is breaking. We have this huge scale challenge. So we can't even celebrate the fact that we've gotten all these new e-commerce customers because they're really suffering in all these different areas. So the themes that I took away from 2020 were really around like resilience, and just, hunkering down and getting it done, even though it's really uncomfortable and painful, because now everyone's experiencing this resurgence. And then also preparing for the bad times and the good times, so that you forecast ahead to the bad times. You think, oh, okay, well, in the bad times, traffic will be way down. We won't have infrastructure issues. We won't have scale issues. But actually the opposite could be true. And then it's the worst of both worlds. So preparing in advance has been a big takeaway for us on the technology side.
And Taleeb, as for Jane's 2020 year in review, what were the most important learnings when you look back?
So many. I mean, it really was, as Michelle said, it really was a trip for us. I mean, we also, everybody going to work from home, all of a sudden having to take an entire business that has been, so used to being, in the office, to all of a sudden moving really everybody home overnight and trying to make sure the business ran was a really, I think it was transformative for the business in a lot of ways, right? Because first, I think we realized that working from home for a lot of people worked quite well, and it actually allowed us to attract and retain talent across the country, and in fact, around the world. It really allowed us to diversify our workforce in a way that has been very, very meaningful for the business. I think the other thing too was that the incredible growth that we experienced allowed us to do things and to think about things from a technology and a platform perspective that we may not have been able to do otherwise. The need to be able to pivot quickly, the need to be able to think about how the types of inventory we brought on, how we thought about imaging, given the constraints around photography, around people being able to do in-person shoots. All of these things became a huge part of, I think, a very meaningful transformation of our business, and I think has left us much better off in many ways. I think COVID has accelerated so many of the things that we should have done and would have done, but never got around to doing as a business. And so when I think about our platform, when I think about how we now market, the story that we now tell, the reach of where we are in terms of our customers, so much of that has really transformed over the course of 2020. The benefits of which we are in some cases now seeing, but also, the consequences of that growth, which we're now experiencing. So it was challenging in many ways, but I think it was also incredibly positive in terms of how we were able to transform as a business, both in terms of the nature of work, but also the nature of the experience that we were able to provide to our sellers and to our customers.
And Nicole, now you recently left your role at Amazon after 8 years. And how did you spend your 2020? And what were your most important learnings and observations?
I spent 2020 with the Prime Video team, the marketing team, and obviously streaming did not suffer at all during the pandemic, right? That was what we were all doing. But I think really, to kind of echo what my fellow panelists have said, this really was a year to look back and say, we really need to make sure our operational foundation is in place. So when the unexpected happens, or even so the changes that are going to be required of us coming up, really understanding your process. And I mean, from your workflows, right? Documenting your workflows, understanding upstream, even downstream, because, I think we all realize when something changes, we are impacted, maybe upstream, right? Or we're impacting somebody downstream. So really understanding our processes and taking a look at our technology. I think we all wish that we had our stronger technology to support our teams working at home, right? Whether that is like, how can I see work in progress? Really taking a look at your technology. So that might be something like a workflow tool, or it might be something as basic as your asset management system. Is your asset management system where you want it to be? What does your DAM look like? Do you need a CAM? What is going to help everyone focus on what they need to do, especially if your volumes are fluctuating, right? So a permission-based CAM to have certain people have access to assets, so you don't have maybe your production team always sourcing them for people, right? Things as basic as that. And then I think the other thing is really being mindful of the roles you're prioritizing. We often really suffer by not having enough headcount, right, to meet our demand. But what about these roles that will help your entire team? And I know it's really difficult to prioritize these roles, but I mean change management roles. I mean program and project management roles. What are we doing that are going to not only enable our growth, bring in our new technologies, but what are we doing to support our teams and leading us into the future? So for me, it was all about really building that strong foundation, which is going to support our success, reduce churn, all those things we really, really needed last year. So I think that was the big takeaway, is always keep an eye on your operational foundation and really make sure it's strengthened.
As we know, retail businesses were particularly hard hit by the COVID-19 pandemic. Yet e-commerce demand, after an initial dip, was growing, and operational requirements were shifting. Now, businesses with high-touch studio operations and contact labor were vulnerable, yet others were scaling up quite rapidly. What are some of the changes you've seen as a result of this crisis, this time last year versus now? Nicole, do you want to get started?
I think this was really interesting to see. And I think, Taylor brought up such a good point, that it's really impressive, the solutions that have come out of this to help us. But I think we still struggle with changing maybe the mindset of people who have, are used to working in a traditional way, have the model on set. And obviously that was beyond challenging this last year, right? And so you see people say, I heard things like, oh, the models will come hair and makeup ready. Well, for anyone who's spent any time on set, the model's hair and makeup, under the lights, changing the clothes, it is being tweaked and touched up and, hundreds of times a day on set. So, that when people would say that to me, I thought that's interesting, because that's not really how it works, right? So even shifting to shooting flats, to using influencers, all of these were huge changes to standard operating procedure for the operations team, not to mention the creative teams, right? How are they going to incorporate this? And, logistically, none of those solutions were easy to implement. So I would say, like, everyone needs to be understanding the new technologies that are available, like contactless capture stations, right? It's still very expensive right now, but really, what does that mean? Solutions like Looklet, is that an option for you? How would you use it? What is the cost comparison? And have this information available to you. And so that you can kind of educate your organization, your leadership, your creative teams on what this means, what this could look like. And the other thing I would encourage people is, if you see new technology out there you're interested in, and it's not quite there, partner with these companies to get it there, right? I think these companies are very open to learning. So don't wait until you need it and just discard it. It's 70% there, whatever. Work with these people now and these companies to get them where you need them to be. I think as leaders in this field, that's our job, to help usher in that new technology. So, I just say be so open to the technology.
And Taleeb, what have you been seeing as changes?
I think there are so many things. I think one of the most interesting ones for us was supply chain related, right? I mean, you have, in a marketplace, you have supply chain, you have product that is really coming from all over the place. And when the entire country gets shut down or states get shut down, it becomes incredibly difficult to be able to move product, right? So for us, one of the big changes really on the fly was finding new supply in different places, in states that were open, making sure that we were able to source supply there, in countries that were still able to ship stock to the United States, looking there. That was something that required us to really, really pivot in a way that we ordinarily would not have had to, right? Because if all of a sudden California got shut down, all of our supply in California, those products are no longer available to customers. So looking at how to make those changes and adapt, that was a big piece for us. And of course, then that also then speaks to the question of how do you present that inventory on the site? How do you think about, shooting those images? How do you think about making sure those images look the way that you want them to, whether it was finding new suppliers or working with the old ones that had, looking at sellers that had perhaps, now had more constraints around them of what they could or couldn't do. These were all things that we really had to, come to grips with. And then you add to that, you layer on top of that, having to do seasonal photo shoots. and thinking about, some of the changes we've already talked about, how do you make sure that you're able to get everybody ready? So instead of looking externally, we looked at using some of our staff for our shoots. How do you adapt and how do you evolve? These were things that, particularly in the elements that are tactile, where you can't escape from moving physical product or involving physical beings, that's where I think so many of the transformations really came.
Michelle, what were your observations on the topic?
Yeah, actually, so we were mostly flexible in terms of our work schedule before. So a lot of people would work remotely whenever they wanted to or needed to. So that part was a fairly easy transition, although there were a couple of team members where they just couldn't hang with that kind of more autonomous uh, work style. So that was a challenge. We also onboarded several new people. We hired new people and hadn't met them in person until a couple weeks ago. So that was definitely a challenge for the culture. And then we had some people leave because they didn't ever, fully indoctrinate into the culture and to feeling really like they were bound somehow with the other team members. And startups are hard, right? I mean, there's lots of ups and downs. And I think one of the reasons that people work in startups is because of the camaraderie and you're working with really top talent, amazing, intelligent people who are fun, and you're in the trenches together. And that's hard to replicate fully online, especially for someone who might have joined completely remote. So I think that was our biggest challenge, was really making sure the culture remained intact and that people still felt bound to the mission of the company and bound to each other. And some of the things we did to address that were obviously like virtual events, things like that. But we did in-person events outside as soon as it was, somewhat safe, but socially distant, and just spent time not even talking about work. Since things have opened up a little bit more, team members have gotten together. We have a lot of people in Brooklyn. We're based in New York City, but a lot of people live in that particular borough, and they would do a meetup and just do some co-working together in a space, just to kind of share territory again. And then also just really making sure that everyone's contribution was highlighted across the company so that it was very obvious what team members were contributing to and doing. But obviously, we don't have a lot of physical hardware or infrastructure or anything that needs to be dealt with in person. So it was really more around kind of the softer skills. But our customers, our retailers and brands, had crazy challenges where an outbreak would shut down an entire distribution center. And they would have to ask us, hey, all the content that you're making, that your engine is producing, that's showing, outfits from distribution center 7, take all of those products out. And fortunately, because, that's the whole point of what FindMine does, is we are using content as a strategic lever to achieve your KPIs. And we're using AI to produce it. So no human has to go back around and find all the assets where products from distribution center 7 live and take them out. We were able to just in the code switch over so that no products from that DC are available. So fortunately, with nimble technologies, retailers can get around those big challenges, because otherwise you would have a lot of out of stock disappointments having to tell customers, sorry, we don't have that product we were showing you in this asset. And people in 2020, I think, were very, very understanding, because obviously everyone was going through it. It was this huge shock to everything and everyone. So there was a lot of goodwill from consumers. And I spoke on another event recently about kind of what 2021 holiday will look like. And I think people's patience has gone way down since 2020, and the expectations are really sky high again. And so there's less margin for error now, which means even if you have maybe not an outbreak in your distribution center, but you have some kind of staffing shortage, because it's hard to find people who are working a lot of jobs these days, they're not going to be as patient. Your consumers aren't going to be as patient with you to recover from that. So you still need to have that nimbleness to be able to handle it in the coming, weeks, months, and years.
So I think we can all agree that 2020 forced us to think about fundamental issues in the fashion ecosystem, like overproduction and inventory pileups. So what are the systemic changes you see happening now? Taleeb, we can start with you.
I think some of this we've already talked about, right? But I think the systemic changes are really the ones that we were forced to make, right? I think if you look at team, for example, the idea of how do you build a workforce that is truly global as opposed to being centered and centralized around one place? How do you think about the other thing about 2020 that we haven't really talked about, I mean, I think is the push and realization around diversity and the importance of being able to embrace and speak about, not just in words, but also in actions in terms of what people see on our website. For example, a reflection of the diversities that we all really seek to embrace. And I think that was another powerful, systemic opportunity that certainly we at Jane, I know others have embraced, and really, in some sense, was made actually quite a bit easier by the fact that we were all working from home and all working from all over the country, to be able to find new ways to tell those stories and to showcase the diversity of our sellers, of our customers, to be able to showcase differences in image on the website. So I think for us, that was a systemic change that really did come about as a direct result of so much of what happened in 2020, and has, I think, made our organization and our team much better. And I think really it reflects much more of who we are. So, for me, beyond all of the technological systemic changes we've had to make in terms of remote work and all of those types of things, and the systems work that we've had to do in terms of the psychology of work from remote locations, to my mind, the whole notion of being inclusive, being able to embrace people in so many different ways through a very, very challenging year, has, to my mind, been a critical opportunity that I'm so glad that we and others have actually embraced.
And Michelle, what are the systemic changes you see happening now?
Yeah, I think that the inventory issue was really acute during COVID, because not only were the retail stores closed, but the off-price stores were closed too, and were the retail versions of those. So liquidating your inventory became really, really hard to do. And if you think about how crazy it is from a sustainability standpoint to produce a product, ship it to, the brand or retailer's warehouse, ship it to the consumer, have the consumer return it, and then ship it somewhere else to a different place where you can liquidate it. There's a lot of steps and carbon situation happening in all those legs of the journey of a product across the entire supply chain. And I think that having COVID force, people to not have off price as a channel, or not be able, not have like product going from the warehouse, the customer, the warehouse to a store, to an off price channel, was actually almost a good thing, because I think retailers might have gotten a little addicted to that, opportunity. And so there wasn't any real downside to overproducing. I mean, obviously the CFO would disagree, but a lot of people in the organization don't feel it as acutely. And so, having to shift everything in order to make sure your inventory is getting sold through at an appropriate rate, that you don't have to use all these ridiculous levers that have huge carbon and margin impacts as well, force people to come up with a new paradigm. And one of the things FindMine became known for during the pandemic, which we weren't before, is using content as a strategic lever to improve margin. So what that means is, if you have a product performing behind plan and you're like, we should have sold X number of units and we've only sold, X minus 20% units, and we're going to have to put it on sale soon, or we're going to have to liquidate it, or we're not going to make our margin plan. FindMine can detect that signal and push that product through more content. So in the Looklet FindMine kind of partnership world, that could mean changing the product that's shown on the model to the skirt rather than the shorts, because the skirt's performing behind plan. We need to get more eyeballs on that. We need to help customers understand how to wear this skirt. Maybe it's something that they're less comfortable with from a style standpoint, so we can guide them better, and just get more distribution of that skirt out into the ecosystem to increase the sell-through of that product. And then our technology can measure whether that's hurting your overall revenue or your overall margin, because maybe that product is just a dog, but maybe it's not. Maybe the reason that the customer isn't resonating with it is they don't know how to use it, or that they don't have enough exposure to it, and how to wear it for work, for a date night, for a girls' night out. And that's huge in terms of using your kind of whole content ecosystem to deliver on your margin plan and to make sure your sell through is hitting the appropriate rate. And I think there's a sustainability impact there that's really strong. And I think people are much more open to that now versus being like, no, we don't have a problem. We just send it to off price. It's fine.
And Nicole, what are your thoughts?
I think, what Michelle is saying, this technology to help improve that. I mean, this is obviously a game changer versus just putting things discounted on a site, right? So I think to kind of follow up with what Michelle's saying, to encourage the either the brands you're working with or if you're in-house to kind of prepare that logic, like at what point are we pushing things or trying new strategies, and what does that look like, right? And by logic, I mean, how long has it been on the site? At what point do you know to push, right? So that these things can become automated, right? So if we can put logic behind it, we can automate these and work with these technology partners. If we're looking at more traditional routes, is this, again, I can't stress enough, understanding your workflows to know where the problem might be occurring. Is it something as simple as, time to market is so critical for fashion. Did we not get it on site fast enough? And what were the reasons? Is there a boat stuck somewhere in the world, right? Like, should we be looking at sourcing it where the product is? Or do we have those partnerships in place? What are the options? And if we are talking about traditional sites to just sell merchandise, what do we need to know from an imaging perspective, right? Are we cropping these? Do we have the usage? Like what do we need to know so we're prepared for this? And when we understand the logic, we can just go ahead and do what's needed. But I also think really kind of stopping things like inventory pileups. And I had just read, and there may be somebody on this panel who knows more about it than I do, but Zara is making a substantial investment in technologies to understand how their clothing is performing. So I think really also focusing on knowing the customer, right? And this is so tricky in the fashion space because things change so quickly, and this is seasonal merchandise. But really, like, how can we better understand our customers so we understand what they're looking for? And then to the point, if inventory isn't moving, is the right thing to do is just to maybe, recrop it and put it on a discount site? Or do we actually need to put more effort into that imaging, more money into it, right? Like, I personally, there's one website I love, their styling is amazing, and they sell me on 90% of what I buy. But I don't often buy from their site because they don't have my size, right? They have an inventory. Well, for me, it's a problem. But, how are we really? So I'm buying that product from another site, but they didn't sell it to me. This other site with this beautiful styling sold it to me, right? So do we have the wrong strategy? Are we just looking at dollars, or are we thinking about this more from a creative perspective? So I think, from a creative operations standpoint, there's a lot of things to reconsider here. But certainly stopping it before it starts is probably the best solution.
On to another topic. Sustainability and carbon neutrality are going to be an undeniable imperative for brands and retailers over the coming years. Shoppers are spending in alignment with their values, and brands need to step up this challenge. What are some core planks of sustainability strategy that you're expecting to see in the businesses that you've come across? Michelle, I'm going to throw this one first to you.
Sure. So I think that consumers' demand has completely changed. And it's sort of segmented. So not everyone cares about, values of sustainability within the brands that they're purchasing from, but you're starting to see a lot more, especially kind of like higher earning type cohorts of people really start thinking more carefully about their consumption and moving to things like a capsule wardrobe. So being able to highlight, there's no reason that every retailer or brand in fashion can't provide capsule wardrobes, but there's direct-to-consumer startups who are all about the capsule wardrobe. And then they have kind of a sustainable element for the clothing themselves. But it doesn't mean that a brand or a retailer who isn't, doing sustainability in their supply chain at like an elite level, or in their materials or sourcing, their labor, all that stuff, that they can't participate in sustainability through the idea of capsule wardrobes and helping customers kind of think more critically about how they're putting their pieces together. And that's, I mean, obviously this is a shameless plug for FindMine because that's what we help do. It's very tedious and time consuming for a merchant or a stylist to put all those pieces together and keep them updated and make sure that they all kind of work with each other in the capsule. But that is something that consumers are increasingly looking at, and FindMine can help make that possible and automate it. And then the other one really is around the inventory piece that I mentioned, like all those legs of the journey that a product takes to get to you. Even if you don't, as a consumer, know all of the pieces because you don't, research it, or it's sort of unseen to you, you do know every time you get a package home how much stuff you have to break down and recycle, or hopefully you're not throwing it away. But there's a very visceral, physical embodiment of the waste that you are participating in when you buy a product online. And every time I open a package, even from some of the places that I consider to be more leading edge on sustainability, I cringe when my product is in a plastic bag with a sticker on it, which you have to take off before you can recycle your plastic in a number 4 recycling place, which for us is I take my plastic bags to Home Depot and I recycle them there because there's no curbside recycling for that in New York City. And the sticker contaminates it, so you have to take it off. And then it's like wrapped in like bubble wrap, and then there's tissue paper in there, and then there's the cardboard of the box. And so I think that just getting creative about that piece alone could go a long way, because everybody sees that. Even if you haven't fixed all the pieces that are unseen to the consumer, that's what makes people like me cringe, and that's an easy thing to change.
Nicole, and what's your advice for retailers who need to stay ahead of evolving sustainability needs?
I'm going to take this in a little different direction. Again, coming from that creative operations space, how do we educate these consumers on the efforts that we are doing in the sustainability space? So, much like the food industry is very confusing, I think this is new territory. So what does it mean? At what point, maybe that item doesn't actually look very different, right? So it was somewhere along the journey or in the process. So we're not talking just about product imaging anymore. How are we telling this story? How are we presenting that on the site? How do we successfully do this? Because a lot of this is in education. So I think, for me, that is going to be the big question about these sustainability efforts is this isn't just showing a product. This is now, there is more information. Maybe it's even a labeling process that it's going to turn into, I don't know. And what does that even mean, right? What do these things mean? So I think that is big. And of course, what Michelle talked about, the packaging. And when you get the amount of returns on top of that, this becomes even more serious, right? Like all the shipping to only be returned and not result in dollars. So I think that I think there's so much in this space, but even as this is being solved, how do we educate our consumers on the efforts the brands are taking, right? And so I think that'll be huge. And I think like there are going to be certain mediums that are really play to this, like social media, right? Like really great spaces to talk about this. And that becomes in our equation of how we're creating content for our brands, et cetera. So I think, but I do think that this is going to be huge. It already is huge. I think it's just going to keep growing, things that we need to address.
Taleeb, can you share with us what you expect in sustainability in fashion? What will improve, and maybe also what you've adopted already at Jane?
One of the interesting sort of things that we have seen is that we are a marketplace, right? So our dependency on our ability to influence sustainability, like many others who are really in the business of facilitating the transaction, is quite limited. But where we have the ability to make a difference is working with our sellers to kind of educate them around the very same things that we've talked about. How do you ensure that your packaging is sustainable? How do you ensure that you're using as little packaging as possible? How do you make sure that the products that you're using in which to ship, where you're combining items, what can we do in the first instance from a packaging perspective to limit the amount of waste that our sellers are creating? Then we're working with other partners to look at ways in which we can distribute that, and we can work on the supply chain more effectively to make sure that our supply chain really is much more environmentally sustainable than as much as possible. We are looking at the best efficiencies that we can. Then when it comes to things like shipping, you know, working with shipping partners to find the most efficient, most, you know, as much as possible carbon neutral ways of getting product into the hands of customers. So these are the types of things that we have been very, very much focused on. Then there is a real element, I think, where marketplaces like ours can have a meaningful impact, where we're already seeing this behavior. And how are people upcycling clothing, recycling clothing? How can our suppliers look at more sustainable ways of sourcing product? And so we've been working in the background to figure out exactly where additional supply can be, you know, found that really does take into account those principles, and as much as possible looks at adaptive reuse of what is there to be able to bring that, you know, back into use rather than ending up in waste.
So few sectors in the fashion industry are developing as fast as e-commerce. And what do you see as the biggest challenges and also opportunities for 2022? Taleeb, can you please share the core e-commerce strategy planks you're focusing on at Jane?
Challenges and opportunities in 2022, I think I break them down into three things. One is really the people element of this, and how do businesses, you know, transform again from being, you know, off, you know, from what they were to being, you know, remote, to now having to figure out what the new world looks like, and managing, I would argue, burnout and other things that employees, I think, have been feeling as a result of the current state of affairs. I think the second is really around understanding what consumer behavior is going to be. How do we ensure that we are being responsive to new things in customer behavior around whether it is shopping habit, whether it is what they are buying, how they are thinking about re-engaging with the world in a very different way than they did in 2020, and perhaps even the way that they did in 2019. You know, what does that physical hybrid look like, online, offline? How are consumers thinking about things? And I think, you know, the third is the external environment. And how do we think about marketing in a new era where marketing costs continue to go up? How do we think about, you know, looking at social commerce and new things that became that really were seeded during the course of 2021? And as we looked at 2020 and 21, as we look at 22, you know, making sure that we are going to be ahead of the curve on innovation, ahead of the curve on making sure that we are where consumers are going to be rather than where they already are. And I think that for us, looking at all the different lines of commerce and ways in which people are thinking about enjoying their shopping experience at the same time as they're thinking about the sustainability elements and the social justice elements of how they actually think about shopping and think about their, you know, spending their money. Those are very, very important things for us, and that we've really taken to heart.
And Nicole, as you were at Amazon for so many years, what do you think we can expect to see from, you know, either them, if you can share, or perhaps other large players?
I think, you know, this need to understand our customers, you know, and looking at information or analysis from a year ago probably isn't going to cut it anymore. So really an emphasis on what are we seeing, what are the trends, how do we connect with our customers, and how do we retain them? And I definitely don't have the answers to that here, but I think, you know, trying to understand that, trying to dive into that information, is that going to require personalization, for example, right? And what does that even mean to us? How do we even bring that? And it will be different for different companies. But the other thing, and I'm going to go back to this, and I know I've already said it, but really just understanding how to bring value in the operations piece. We are always going to be asked to cut costs, cut time, cut everything. But what isn't, the challenge gets even greater, because what isn't going to change is that creative has to be better, and it has to be on time, right? Like, we know that connection to the customer, especially online, is through great creative, right? So this is really going to be a challenge in those creative operation spaces. So, you know, again, really making sure that you've done your due diligence in that space, and you can at least come back to your business partners and say, this will be the impact. If we want to do this, this will be the impact, to timing, to cost, etc. And really, again, you know, looking at these new technologies, because we won't be able to continue working in the same traditional ways we have and keep up with the demand of what we're seeing, social media just being one of them, but all the different placements. That's very different content for social media than we're looking at in other spaces. We know what works there is very different than what works in other spaces. So just, really, really challenging yourself, like, how am I going to I may not know what these changes are, but I know they're coming. And what do I need to do to prepare for that?
And Michelle, what would you say is FindMind's role in this as a tech solution?
Yeah, as a technology company, I think my answer is always similar and is always equally boring, but it's scale, like using technology to achieve scale. I mean, there's no reason that people need to be doing the same tedious task 10,000 times over. No one wants to do it to do that. And I think a lot of companies, a lot of brands and retailers, they sort of have this like, we want to consolidate vendors, we want to build everything in-house mentality. And that's not the way to grow. And Nicole was talking about that in the kind of creative operations space, that everyone always wants to cut costs, and that happens with technology vendors as well. But that's not the solution to grow and scale. That's actually, hurting your chances of taking advantage of this kind of huge growth in e-com, riding that wave. It's only going to hurt you in the long run, and maybe not even in that long of a run. It's going to maybe cut a few dollars in the short run, but in the medium and even near medium term, you're going to end up paying for it because your systems are going to be, too brittle. Your teams can't move fast enough. You can't hire enough good talent. There's such a crunch on talent right now. If you think you're going to take a lot of things in-house, you're mistaken. It's much easier to get much faster with partnering with great technology companies who can add scale to your operations. And then also thinking about, where there's manual work that is taking too long, and how do you cut that out, especially because there's a talent shortage, not even just across technology folks, but every kind of role right now is really hard to fill. And so if you're like, well, we can hire, 10 people for $15 an hour to just do this manually, do it by hand, it's not scalable in the long run, but in the short run we can do it. You might not be able to find 15 people to do that. So whether or not it's a good use of their time in the grand scheme of things is sort of irrelevant, because you might not even be able to get the bodies in place to do that task. And so using technology that is smart and can automate those and let the human brain do what it's meant to do, that technology and AI can't replicate, but then using the AI and technology to get you to scale with those activities means that you can ride out those talent shortages. And when you can hire more talent, you can put them to work on things that are higher level, that can drive your company forward, more like, driving innovation rather than just trying to keep up with day-to-day operations or tedious tasks that are repetitive that should be handled by the technology at scale.
Now, let's take a 5-year look ahead, a little bit into the future. So how do you think the winning brands and retailers will differentiate themselves in the next 5 years?
I think that if I look to the next 5 years, I think there's a few things that really top of mind. One is, there is an increasing dependence on good quality data. How do we actually look at data and information about the customer, about the market, and really become adaptive and responsive? And I don't think that's a short-term answer. I mean, that's a long-term answer, because the different types of information, the different types of data that we get about how customers are responding, how supply is responding, it has to be part of our modeling. But I think as we look to the future, the brands and the retailers, and I think the marketplaces that are going to be successful are the ones that are able to best create a truly omni-channel experience, right? The idea that you can be in a store, or you can look at a physical product wherever it is and be able to engage with it offline and online. That's going to be, in my view, that is the real future. I think we're going to start to see more and more models where, what you experience online should, as much as possible, mirror what you might see or feel in a store without the tactile opportunity. But that tactile opportunity in a store is not an end unto itself. There is so much more that you can do with that product, understand about that product, that supplier, offline, online. So, our ability to look at shopping or retail as something that is at once fun, but also going to be driven by information and done in a way that perhaps we may not really have imagined before, I think is the most powerful kind of lesson for us to be thinking about over the course of the next 5 years. Because if we do that correctly, what you're really able to do is you're able to blend in so many of the things that we've talked about today into a true experience for the consumer that is at once satisfying in terms of that experience, but also in terms of how it is that those outputs can be achieved and what it actually means in terms of a business's ability to be very much sustainable in terms of what that business can really be from a longevity standpoint, right? If you are adaptive and responsive to customer need today, and you're actually thinking about where that customer is going over the course of the next 5 years, that customer's mind is evolving. That customer is using technology, interfacing with products and services that didn't exist 2-3 years ago. If you look at things like Instagram today, I mean, who knew we would be Instagram shopping 3 years ago? So knowing where technology is going and making sure our products are able to adapt and evolve, and that we're passing that information onto those that we engage with, whether they're suppliers or customers, in a way that is truly responsive and forward thinking. I think that's the way. I mean, those are going to be the brands, marketplaces, and retailers that are truly successful.
Michelle.
So I have a really passionate answer to this topic, because it's the whole reason we started the company, which is that we believe that retailers and brands' only sustainable competitive advantage is their expertise and their unique point of view, which is unique to them. It's not something that's replicable by, Amazon will never get to own the Adidas Three Stripes life or that Nike goodwill that's associated with the brand, even though Amazon might sell both of those products. So really scaling and protecting that expertise, that editorial point of view, the way that the brand looks at the world, and helping your consumer feel like the brand has the consumer's back when it comes to fashion. That means I'm going to look great every time I buy from this brand. I always know what I'm doing, what I'm getting, and having that really strong kind of brand affinity in the consumer's mind, I think is going to make or break, different brands and retailers. The ones that we'll see disappear are the ones that don't have that strong affinity, the ones that are sort of addicted to a discount cycle. And that's why the customer goes there versus the customer goes there because I love this brand. It just has my back. It makes me feel great. And that's such an esoteric thing to do. But that's what, we at FindMine are trying to scale, is helping brands and retailers cultivate that in a way that the consumer always consistently feels that no matter where they're shopping. And it kind of goes back to Taleeb's omni-channel point about having that experience be consistent and helping the customer understand who this brand is, what they stand for, no matter whether they're interacting with them on Instagram or they're interacting them within a store or with a virtual personal shopper in a remote selling experience or some new medium that hasn't even been created yet. The consistent element needs to be, who is this brand? What are they? And getting that information to the consumer, no matter where or how they're shopping in the future.
Nicole, what would you add? 5 years ahead, differentiation of brands and retailers?
Sure. Well, I absolutely agree with my fellow panelists. So I'm going to take in a little different direction and say, I think there's so much opportunity to differentiate with how we engage with customers. And, I'm using a term that I didn't make up, but, retailtainment. How can I shop from what I'm seeing on streaming, right? Like, I loved what she was wearing. I need that shoe. So this kind of, these new ways of reaching people, VR, AR, right? Like, I mean, the way to promote your brand on these new technologies would be like nothing we've ever seen, right? I also think that how we image, like, the discussion for a lot of us in the imaging space is what is the right size? How do we address diversity? And being able to put those choices in the customer's hands will be so powerful, right? So I'm choosing what I want this model to look like, or maybe I want to see it on myself, right? So these are going to be, not only will that help with returns, I think this is going to change the shopping experience. But in fairness, some people don't want to see, I don't necessarily want to see items on myself, right? I want something a little more aspirational, but that I might be very different. So letting people choose how they want to see these clothes represented, I think will be huge. And then I'm going to end this on a really boring note, but just that how secure and how easy is it to actually pay on this site, right? If I have to do more than one click, I'm exhausted, right? I'm like, oh, I'll do it later. And then I never come back. So really, making sure that the ease of this, we're there, right? And I expect it to be safe, right? I expect you to have the due diligence in place for security, but I want it to be that simple. So I think, the payment is still such a key part of this, but really just looking for fun new ways to interact with clients and to share the brand. I'm looking forward to seeing that.
Amazing. Thank you so much for your insights. I think this has been fantastic. You've been wonderful speakers, and thank you to our audience for listening.
Yeah, thank you from my side as well to our speakers and panelists. I learned a lot, I enjoyed it a lot, so this was great. Now, today we talked about whatever we could fit into 60 minutes. We talked about the challenges of the pandemic, how retail and e-commerce in particular adapted, but also how content and photo production can become a competitive edge in a challenging environment. We talked about the evolving needs and demands from consumers, specifically around sustainability. And we talked about the challenges, but also the opportunities in the e-commerce world that we expect over the next 5 years and what role digital technologies can play.
Exactly. And I think at Looklet, we're super grateful to have been able to help our clients navigate these tricky waters. And we're super excited for the future. And please stay tuned for more Looklet events coming up.